So basically last week I started by talking about how to understand these readings in relation to Bonhoeffer's other work. And I said there are those people who kind of read the letters and papers in continuity with Bonhoeffer's other works. And what happens then is you really get a more kind of confessional, evangelical theologian. Then there are others who read his work at the end of his life as a radical discontinuity, that Bonhoeffer, had a change of mind and a change of heart while he was in prison. And then what I try to argue is that I feel convinced by the argument that Bonhoeffer has had an existential and intellectual change that can open up a key to reread his earlier work. So there is a discontinuity, but actually if we therefore go back to his early work, we can find elements of this brewing, which means in a sense that if we never had these later writings, we would probably never see this radical dimension to Bonhoeffer's earlier work. I'm actually rereading his Ethics at the moment, this book, which was a book that he wrote. He was writing right up to the point that he got arrested by Gestapo, and they confiscated some of it. Some of it is kind of pretty well rounded. Some chapters are pretty much finished. Other chapters are kind of more notes. So it's not a complete work, but it is the closest thing we have to the theological text that he was working on before he went to prison. And reading it, I've read it before, or bits of it before, but this time I'm kind of going systematically through it. Again, without the letters and papers, this still comes across as a very confessional, conservative piece of work with some, flashes of insight and some interesting things. But when you kind of read it in light of what he wrote in prison, you can, I think, start to also see some more radical dimensions to the work. There's a philosopher called Quentin Mesu who invented really an interesting way of approaching kind of a philosophical text. It's kind of like a new pedagogy. And what he did is he basically took a paragraph from a philosopher, I can't remember what philosopher it was, but a well-known philosopher who had published lots of work. But he treated the fragment as if that was the only thing we had of the philosopher, like he was some Greek philosopher and all his work had been destroyed. I think it was Deleuze. And that the only piece of this philosopher's work we had left was literally this one piece. And then he kind of read it like that. And he said, how would we reconstruct this philosopher if only we had this small piece of work? And then what happens is you get a new philosopher that kind of comes out of it, because what you end up with looks a little bit like the real philosopher, but also, looks a little bit different. And I think we're doing a similar pedagogy here with these fragments from letters and papers. I'm almost saying to you, let's imagine that this is all we have of Bonhoeffer, that all his other works were destroyed by the Gestapo, that these fragments were smuggled out of prison. What kind of character, what figure would we reconstruct from these writings? And what we'll end up with is someone who, in some ways is different from the Bonhoeffer we see in Ethics and in Cost of Discipleship, but also some sort of continuity. So anyway, there's just kind of an approach that I'm taking to these works, because, to be honest, the conservative readers of Bonhoeffer, there is a lot of legitimacy to that reading. Whenever you read the early Bonhoeffer, he kind of often does come across in a very conservative way. You could be a very, politically conservative person, and I think get a lot out of Bonhoeffer. But it's this latter work that I think really makes him pop. And in particular, it's one concept. If we want to boil it down and simplify it, it's the concept of religionless Christianity. So in the same way that Bultmann is famous for demythologizing, the term demythologizing, I think, Bonhoeffer's real contribution at the end of his life was this notion that we might be able to interpret Christianity outside of a religious guise, a religious frame. And, we've already started to touch on that last week. This week, I think we can really begin to clarify what he means by that term. And again, I want to kind of stay pretty close to what the text says. So we'll start by reading, I think I'll read the first paragraph and then talk a little bit about that. So he's talking about, Weinsacker's, don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Weinsacker's book, The Worldview of Physics. He says, is still keeping me very busy. It has again brought home to me quite clearly how wrong it is to use God as a stopgap for the incompleteness of our knowledge. If in fact the frontiers of knowledge are being pushed back further and further, and that is bound to be the case, then God is being pushed back with them and is therefore continually in retreat. We are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. God wants us to realize his presence not in unsolved problems, but in those that are solved. That is true of the relationship between God and scientific knowledge, but it is also true of the wider human problems of death, suffering, and guilt. It is now possible to find, even for those questions, human answers that take no account whatever of God. In point of fact, people deal with these questions without God. It has always been the case. And it is simply not true to say that only Christianity has the answers to them. As to the idea of solving problems, it may be that the Christian answers are just as unconvincing or as convincing as any other ones. Here again, God is no stopgap. God must be recognized as the center of life. Not when we are at the end of our resources. It is his will to be recognized in life, and not only when death comes, in health and vigour, and not only in suffering, in our activities, and not only in sin. The ground for this lies in the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. He is the centre of life, and he certainly didn't come to answer our unsolved problems. From the centre of life, certain questions and their answers are seen to be wholly irrelevant. I'm thinking of the judgment pronounced on Job's friends. In Christ, there are not Christian problems. And enough of this, I've been disturbed again. So, he's writing in prison, constantly being disrupted. Okay, so he's reading this book on physics, and, it's really challenging his worldview. And what Bonhoeffer is saying here then is he's doing a critique of what's called the God of the gaps. So, most of you will know that phrase. It's a critique actually that is used against religion today a lot, where someone says, listen, you use God to describe something you don't know. Like whenever you are ignorant of an answer, when we don't know something, we put God in as a hypothesis. And so every time we move forward in thinking, every time we make scientific discoveries, every time we uncover deeper laws of the universe, God becomes smaller. So God starts off as massive when we don't understand why birds fly, why crops grow, why there are storms, why there is disease. But every time we get natural answers to these questions, then God, in a sense, is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you can still obviously always have a God of the gaps, but as the gaps diminish and decrease, so God becomes less and less relevant to life. And Bonhoeffer is, instead of trying to defend against that argument, he is saying, absolutely, this is a problem. If your God is a hypothesis that you bring in whenever you don't know an answer to something, then it's not the God of Christianity. And then also in this paragraph, and he mentions this in the next paragraph as well, he says, well, also then Christianity, a religious reading of Christianity tries to go, okay, well, you need God to help us in times of distress, when we're facing guilt, when we're facing suffering, when we're facing death. And again, Bonhoeffer is saying, well, people can get along quite well without a religious answer to those questions. There are other responses and answers that might be as convincing or unconvincing as religious answers. And again, if God is only connected with those elements of life, then God is not at the center of existence, but at the very edges of existence. And in the last seminar, we looked at how he has this beautiful image where he says, in the village, the church is at the center, not at the edge. But a religious reading of Christianity for him basically puts God at the edge of life and not at the center of life. So this gives us a very simple kind of way to start grasping what Bonhoeffer means by a religious reading of Christianity. He means a reading of Christianity that relies on our ignorance and our weakness. So in a nutshell, what you have here in these readings is him continually coming back to the idea that religion appeals to our ignorance and our weakness. Our ignorance in terms of the lack of our knowledge in science and humanities, our lack of understanding of the laws of the universe. And in terms of weakness, that whenever we are facing suffering and death and wrongdoing and our violence, we turn to God. So then, he's going to try to go a different direction in this. All right. So I think that's kind of like his concrete reading of religion. Oh yeah. So in the next paragraph, I'm going to go 2 down. He says the movement that began around the 13th century, and in brackets he says, I'm not going to get involved in any argument about the exact date. But it's basically the movement towards what he calls the autonomy of man, in which he says, I include the discovery of the laws by which the world lives and deals with itself in science, in social and political matters, in art, in ethics and religion. Has in our time reached an undoubted completion. So he's saying that like around the 13th century, you see this kind of radical acceleration of our knowledge of the world and ourselves. It's really the development of science, the development of kind of like the intellectual life really takes hold. And he says that this has been continuing into the 20th century, and now we can say like it's reached completion. Now he doesn't mean by that, of course, that we know all things, but just that he mentions a little bit later on that even when our knowledge fails, even when we have setbacks, even when we make mistakes, we kind of know that there are explanations for things. Right? That's what he means. Is like we've now come to feel that in principle, the universe is open to our understanding, that we feel comfortable and confident in the intellectual pursuits and scientific pursuits. There's a connection between thought and the external world, and that we can have access to the external world through logical thinking. So that's kind of the completion. And then he goes on to say, man has learned to deal with himself in all questions of importance without recourse to the working hypothesis called God. In questions of art, science and ethics, this has become an understood thing and at which one hardly dares to tilt. But for the last 100 years or so, it has become increasingly true of religious questions as well. It is becoming evident that everything gets along without God, and in fact, just as well as before. As in the scientific field, so in human affairs generally, God is being pushed more and more out of life, losing more and more ground. So this for Bonhoeffer, even in the midst of the Second World War, even in the midst of like a deeply destructive world event, he's saying that there isn't a return to superstition in any great way. And that now Christianity has to, if it's going to survive, have something to say in that world. Or if it doesn't, then perhaps Christianity is just a relic of the past. And in the same way that we look at the statues of ancient Greece, and they have no religious symbolism for us now, they're just kind of matters of aesthetic appeal. So, we're coming to a point when a crucifix might be an interesting object of art, but it doesn't evoke anything. It doesn't kind of have any existential import or significance to us. Now, Bonhoeffer wants to say that it does and it will, but that's what he's saying. He's saying that if Christianity isn't able to respond to or celebrate this learning of the autonomy of humanity, this celebration of the scientific endeavour, then it's a relic of the past. He goes on to say, the world has become conscious of itself and the laws that govern its own existence, and has grown self-confident in what seems to us to be an uncanny way. False developments and failures do not make the world doubt the necessity of the course that it is taking, or of its development. They are accepted with fortitude and detachment as part of the bargain, and even an event like the present war is no exception. So yeah, that's what he's saying that if an apologist was to point out that in biology there was some mistake, that there was some kind of error, that's a quite significant error in, say, the field of evolutionary theory, most intelligent people will accept that, but they'll just go, yeah, that's par for the course. Of course we're going to make mistakes. Of course there's going to be failures, but that doesn't lend credibility to the God hypothesis. It doesn't lend credibility to the God of the gaps. It's just part of the scientific endeavour and part of being human that mistakes will happen. But the apologist's attempt to unseat science by showing its mistakes, Bonhoeffer is saying here, won't be convincing to anybody. Even if it was the right way to go, it wouldn't convince that many people, because we've got to a stage where we accept the kind of scientific approach, in a basic kind of way. Now here's an interesting thing he says, just halfway down the page 2. He says, of course, we now have the secularized offshoots of Christian theology, namely existentialist philosophy and psychotherapists, who demonstrate to secure, contented and happy mankind that it is really unhappy and desperate and simply willing to admit that it is in a predicament about which it knows nothing and from which only they can rescue it. So Bonhoeffer is making the argument that a religious reading of Christianity is one that is always trying to point out your ignorance and your weakness, and then attempting to say, and we can give you the answer to your ignorance, which is God, and an answer to your weakness, which is kind of like, acceptance into Christianity, the body of Christ. So it has to basically give you bad news and then give you good news. And he brilliantly throws existentialism and psychotherapy under the bus, where he says, these are secular versions of that. For him, a psychotherapist is always digging around, trying to kind of bring out hidden depression, and then kind of trying to give you the answer. And in the same way, for him, existentialism is attempting to find the inauthenticity of humanity, trying to say that we are alienated, and then give us the solution. Now, I think he's misunderstanding both existentialism and psychotherapy, but it is actually true that the kind of crude forms of existentialism and crude forms of psychotherapy can be very much like that, can be very much what he calls secularized Methodism, which is where it's always trying to make you unhappy and therefore then give you the answer. And he wants to find a form of faith, or he believes that there is a form of faith that can celebrate the knowledge of humanity and the strength of humanity. At the bottom of this page, he says that there are 3 reasons why Christianity shouldn't attempt to appeal to our ignorance and our weakness. he says the first is because that approach to Christian apologetics, which by the way we all know. I mean, you see it today in churches where maybe the preacher will say, the universe is this incredible place that we have so little understanding of the wonder of the universe. Look at it. Look at how tiny our understanding is. We know like a speck in comparison to the beach. We know that like a speck of sand in relation to the beach of what we do not know. And God is this great mind, and if you want, that's the answer. Scientists might try and tell you that we can explain everything through evolutionary theory, but actually these are just attempts to make sense of this ultimate mystery of which only God can answer it. Or you'll have a preacher who might say, he might try to draw out how bad you are, try to make you reflect on all the little terrible things you've done to people around you, the thoughts that you've had, the violence that you've committed, both intellectually or in your mind and in reality. And then, after making you feel bad, saying, and you can be forgiven by God. So these are very common approaches that we see used even today. But he says there's 3 reasons why this is not a good direction to go. He says, first of all, it's pointless. And by that he means, like, for most people, it's not convincing. Of course, elsewhere he says there are some people for whom it will be convincing. But today, when you're talking to, intelligent people, it's just not going to wash, right? It's just not going to be convincing. If you point out their weaknesses and point out their ignorance and unknowing, they're likely going to go, well, yeah, that's because we're a young species. We haven't got very far. Yeah, but you know what? Just because we don't know stuff now doesn't mean we won't know stuff in the future. So it just won't be convincing. Second, he says it's ignoble. And by that he says it's kind of bad. Like if someone is mature and thoughtful and intelligent and you're trying to kind of push them back to a kind of infancy, a dependence, trying to kind of like draw out the darkest elements of themselves. There's something like ignoble about that approach. There's something a bit disgusting about it. For example, if you think that Christianity draws someone into a life where they think less of themselves and think more of their neighbour, and where they pour themselves out for the world, then getting them to selfishly think about themselves and their eternal salvation and what's going to happen to them, it feels like it's doing the exact opposite. If this is about a lifestyle that draws you into forgetting yourself, giving yourself over to something greater than yourself, then this process of getting you to think about yourself and think selfishly about your own salvation, he says there's something not right about that. And then thirdly, he says, he calls it unchristian. And by unchristian he means that it's mistaking one form of Christianity with Christianity as such. Which means, like, he says, Christianity and religion has had a religious dimension, and sometimes that has worked, and for some people it works, but it is not the whole thing. And if you think it is, you're missing out on actually potentially the richest and deepest element of Christianity. Okay, so just to cover what we've done so far, a religious reading of Christianity for Bonhoeffer is a reading that appeals to our ignorance and to our weakness. There are secular versions of that, that again appeal to our ignorance and our weakness. He feels that we as human beings from the 13th century onward have begun to gain more autonomy, more understanding of how the universe works. We have more understanding of how political systems work. And so the notion of that God's getting smaller and smaller. And even in questions about death, questions about guilt and suffering, more and more we don't seem to be as convinced by religious answers as maybe we were at another stage. And he goes on to say, even if you could convince people that way. He says it would be ignoble. You shouldn't do it. This is something to celebrate. Knowledge and strength and the developments that human beings have gone through, civilization, there's so much goodness there that to try to force people back to some sort of dark ages is not even the right way to go. Okay, so now what do we do? What's left open to us once we go, okay, maybe a religious reading of Christianity no longer works and is no longer something that is even desirable? Where do we go from there? And this is where we get into kind of his religionless reading. Now, we shouldn't understand Bonhoeffer as saying that, okay, a religionless reading is going to be one that celebrates our knowledge and our strength, right? So if a religious reading celebrates our ignorance and our weakness, then a religionless reading will celebrate our strength and our knowledge. He's not quite saying that. He's a dialectic thinker, which means what Bonhoeffer wants to do is get these two things, or these four things, in right relationship with each other, right? So, like National Socialist religion, like the German church that connected with National Socialism, was a church of strength, and a church that celebrated knowledge and celebrated kind of like the strength of humanity. And Bonhoeffer is definitely not saying that. So he wants to somehow bring strength and weakness, knowledge and ignorance into right relationship, into a right type of antagonism. And so I think it's not clear explicitly, but it's implicitly there. That's what he's trying to do. And even when he says, there was a quote I did. He said, here again, God is no stopgap. He must be recognized as the center of life, not when we are at the end of our resources. And he goes on to say, it is his will to be recognized in life, and not only when death comes, in health and rigor, and not only in suffering, in our activities, and not only in sin. So he's not saying in our rigor and not in suffering. He's saying not just suffering, but also in strength. So what is this right relation? Okay, take the knowledge one first. Ignorance and knowledge in the classical sense have a certain relationship, whereas there's stuff that we know and there is stuff that we don't know, right? So there is, in principle, everything is knowable potentially, in the world, but there's stuff that we don't know. So there's the knowledge we have, and then there is the unknown, which is outside of our realm of knowledge, right? And this is a Kantian type of understanding. So for Kant, there's stuff that we know, the phenomenal world, and then there's what we don't know, the noumenal. We can kind of like indirectly hint at it, but we can never have access to this noumenal realm, which lies outside the realm of knowledge. And so Kantian theology has the idea that there is kind of the world that we know, but God is in this transcendent realm outside of our kind of natural world. Then on the opposite side of that, you could have, there is no transcendence, there is no transcendent realm that is unknowable, something that we cannot grasp or get to. That in principle everything is knowable. We don't know everything, but in principle it is knowable. So this is a purely immanent kind of understanding of reality. Bonhoeffer is going to the dialectical third place, where he's talking about a transcendence that is within immanence. So not a transcendence that is opposite to immanence, not a transcendence that's completely dissolved, so that all there is left is immanence, the immanent field, the world that we're in, but a transcendence that is at the heart of the immanent world. And that again, coming back to the analogy of the church being at the center of the village, not at the side of the village. If you imagine the church being the structure that tries to protect and promote the transcendent realm of life, then the church is at the center of life and not at the edge. So what does that mean? Well, it's interesting that he's reading a book on physics, because in contemporary physics you see this move as well. So when I talk about Kantian theology, which has like the transcendent, which is outside of the immanent. You also have a critique of that, which is Hegelian theology. And Hegelian theology is that the transcendent is within the immanent. But within science, you have this notion. So in physics, traditionally you have this notion, well, everything is understandable in principle, but we just don't know everything. But in quantum mechanics, in the 20th century, you see the development of quantum mechanics, there is this notion that there is an unknown that is hard baked into the immanent world. And it's not an unknown that comes from a lack of understanding. It's an unknown that is revealed only through an incredible depth of understanding. So, of course, we're thinking about superpositioning, wave, particle, duality, these interesting insights that were made in physics, which seem to suggest that there is an inherent unknowability hard baked into reality that is not a signal of the limit of our understanding, but that only comes into focus, only becomes something that we can appreciate through the profound developments of physics. In the realm of psychology and psychoanalysis, that's called the unconscious. Again, the unconscious is a type of nothing that is within something. It's a type of gap that is within consciousness. But you also see this so there's physics, and there's in biology, in love, in our understanding of love. You can not know somebody because you've never met them, so that's a knowledge. You don't know somebody because you've never met them. But then there's an unknowing that comes from knowing somebody. The more you get to know somebody, the more you experience the unknown that they are to themselves and to us. So the knowledge of the person is precisely what makes them a mystery. I mean, that kind of is the unconscious, to be honest, so that's connected with that. But in theology, it's this notion that that the incarnation means that the transcendent is in the world of the immanent. Now, I'm going to actually at the end of this, I'm going to give an example, a concrete example of a religionless reading of something in the Bible to try to clarify this. But ultimately, what I'm just painting at the moment is a picture of what Bonhoeffer wants to say, which is the transcendent is a type of mystery that is in the heart of life, that is in the heart of understanding. Just like superpositioning and wave particle duality is a type of mystery that is hard baked into physics, or the uncertainty principle is hard baked into mathematics. There is this transcendent realm that is in the heart of life. And in terms of strength and weakness, he again wants to get these into right relationship with each other, that there is a strength in acknowledging the weakness of humanity. There is a strength in taking on board our weakness and our violence and our suffering, of facing it head on, of instead of cowering from it, of dreaming of another world where we'll be free of all of our suffering and our traumas and our difficulties, actually facing them head on. So when you do that, there is a strength and an acknowledgement of weakness. So this is Bonhoeffer's kind of move, is he's not saying that we need a Christianity that affirms knowledge and strength, but rather that puts these all in right relationship with each other. And this is going to be a religionless reading of Christianity. And as I say, I'm going to try to give an example of that, which he didn't do because this is kind of what he wanted to do when he left prison. He wanted to be part of trying to work out what it meant to have a religionless reading of Christianity. But in the letters and papers, he says, we are not at a point where we can even do that. But a lot of time has passed since Bonhoeffer. And so I think there are people who are doing it, and parotheology is a concrete attempt to give a religionless reading of Christianity. But before I give you that example, let's just move on, where the next, on page 3 and page 4 of the readings, he starts to place himself in relation to other thinkers. He did that last week as well. He mentioned Barth, and he mentioned Bultmann. I think he mentioned Tillich. But he's coming back to this, and kind of in a nutshell, he's trying to say, okay, the church either has fallen into losing its radical core, because for him, Christianity has something fundamentally powerful to speak into the world, and either the church has kind of like diluted that, and here he's thinking of liberal theology, where Christianity becomes a way of saying, I guess, underlining our morality, underlining our sense of justice, underlining our sense of how the world should be. So it doesn't have anything really to say to the world, to challenge our way of living. It kind of becomes what basically, this is a caricature, but in some sense for Bonhoeffer, he talks about the abridging of the gospel, where you kind of go through and you find bits of the Bible that kind of really are nice, and kind of like talk about, be nice to your neighbor, be kind to people, and it becomes a way of just justifying a bourgeois kind of ethics, but it doesn't have anything like really, really meaty to say. Or on the other side, their Christianity tries to retain this kind of radical difference from the world, but it does so by kind of building up walls and trying to go back to some sort of kind of religious medieval reading of Christianity. It doesn't engage actively with the world. It doesn't try to respond to the world's questions. It doesn't try to be convincing to those questions. It doesn't try to speak in a persuasive way to those questions. So, he's thinking here like of Barth on one side. So for him, Karl Barth is someone who recognizes that there's something powerful in Christianity that can really speak in a very challenging way to the world. But then what Barth does is he kind of then builds these walls, and in the last week we said he says you either like it or lump it, right? With Barth, you kind of go like, yeah, there is this critique of the world, there is this judgment over the world, there is this challenge to the world, but anybody who reads Barth who doesn't already kind of like accept a certain form of religious Christianity, they're not going to be convinced by it. So he feels that Barth's kind of created a fortress. And then on the other side, he thinks Bultmann is more falling on the other side, where Bultmann is trying to like really see how Christianity can speak into the world, does have something to say, is contemporary, but then what Bultmann does is he's abridging the gospel. He goes in and he's taking out bits that, through demythologizing, he says, well, we can't believe in an ascension because literally, heaven is not in the clouds. So the idea of Jesus like, hovering and going into the clouds is just that's a myth that we have to get rid of. But what Bultmann is doing then is he's kind of keeping some bits. He's saying we can't have a virgin birth, we can't have ascension, but we can have, God. And Bonhoeffer says, weirdly, Bultmann doesn't go far enough. That actually, what Bonhoeffer is saying is he's kind of like trying to do something that's different. He's saying, I'm with Barth in that all of Christianity has something to say. These theological terms have something to speak to the world. So like Barth keeps the whole thing. Like Barth respects the whole text, and he just doesn't kind of like he doesn't try to interpret it in a religionless way, but he sees the value of all of these theological terms because they have lastability. They're still in the world. They have effect. So Bonhoeffer's with Barth there, but then he's with Bultmann because he's going like, but you know what? We need to strip them of their religious dimension and reinterpret them in a way that exposes how these terms have something very significant to speak to today's generation and to the world politically that he's living in. So for Bonhoeffer, it's like if you're going to demythologize the way Bultmann does, well, demythologize everything because God is a myth as well. Virgin birth, and it's all mythological. But Bonhoeffer says, but because of that, you can keep it all and reinterpret it all in a demythologized way. Now, interestingly, someone like René Girard would say in relation to Bultmann that you shouldn't demythologize Christianity. Christianity is demythologizing. So, but I just did a lecture on René Girard. So if you're interested in that, go find that, watch that. But Bonhoeffer is saying that his religionless Christianity is an attempt to do justice to all of these theological terms, but to reinterpret them in a way that doesn't have to appeal to our ignorance and our unknowing. All right, so I'm going to give a concrete example, and then I'll look to see if you have any questions or thoughts. And I say this is not an example that Bonhoeffer gave, but I think it expresses everything I'm saying. So let's take a theological idea like Christ. Christ died for our sins, took on our sins, and took on that judgment for our sins, and in doing that, justified us, purified us before God, so that we can be free from that violence and that sin in our lives. And we are the body of Christ. So in some way we replicate that in our communal life, right? So there's a theological term we all know is like, so Christ died for our sins and took on the payment of those sins, and that is how we are forgiven. So what is a religionless way of reading this? And remembering that a religionless way of reading it will appeal to our knowledge and to our ignorance, will appeal to our strength and take seriously our weakness. And then I want to mention one other thing from last week, and will not be embarrassing. Right, that's a key one, because remember Bonhoeffer said, like, I find that I can talk about God and theology more with people who have no interest in those things than with people who are in the church. And he says, not because I'm trying to evangelize people, just because I find solidarity, I find that these ideas are interesting. So you have this image of Bonhoeffer happily talking to people who are not religious at all about Christ, about crucifixion, incarnation, resurrection, and yet being profoundly embarrassed about talking about those concepts within church, where he thinks there's some fundamental misunderstanding. So a religionless reading should tick all of those boxes. Right? So let's go with this. I'm going to use a bit of René Girard from the last seminar I did. So what if then we start with the idea with René Girard that human beings learn how to desire through mimicry. We learn how to value things through looking at what other people value. An infant comes into the world, and their way of navigating the world is through mimicry of their parents and of their siblings, right? And there's a lot of evidence for this, both anthropologically, historically. We can see evidence of it in literature and also in neurobiology. And then part of this mimicry then is we desire what people desire. We mimic people's desires, which for René Girard means that we come into conflict with each other, because I start to desire what you desire, and because of that I come into conflict with you. I want to get rid of you in order to have what you have. And so in a nutshell, this is a very brief overview, but in a nutshell, violence erupts because we start to desire similar things. We start to have all of these jealousies and resentments and envy, which threatens to destroy society. So hard baked into civilization is violence, is suffering, is trauma. And that one of the ways that we deal with this is by creating a scapegoat. And the whole idea of a scapegoat is you kill something else. It might be a person, then it becomes like an animal. It might be the destruction of some property. But in that destruction, You basically put all of your own violence, all of your aggression onto this scapegoat. You kill the scapegoat, and temporarily you feel better, right? Because the scapegoat takes on all of your violence. And so in contemporary society, we have scapegoats, we have people we blame for all of the trouble of the world, that it's all their fault. Just like a hypochondriac has an imaginary disease that they think is responsible for their anxiety, so we blame others for the anxieties and the sufferings and the violence and the envies and the jealousies that we have. You know, the jealousy isn't mine, I'm jealous. I should be jealous, I'm allowed to be jealous. You have what I should have, you know. So we have that story. And then, therefore, in Christianity, you have Christ dies for our sins. So what that means is, you know, in Christianity, Christ represents the scapegoat, but who's innocent. So we realize that, oh my goodness, we put all our violence onto this person, but they are innocent. That actually that is our own violence. So really what is being said is, in Christianity, it's the insight that we have jealousies and envy, and we get into mimetic rivalry with others, and we create violence, and this leads to wars and destruction and all manner of things. But that the scapegoat, the people we blame, the projection, when we project out all of our violence onto somebody else, that is our act of not taking responsibility for that founding violence. That is us not taking responsibility, looking at our jealousies, working through them, you know, stripping them bare. It's our refusal to do that leads to all of this conflict and violence. So whenever you talk about Christ being the innocent lamb, it's like, oh, the scapegoat that we blame for everything is innocent. You know, it is a reflection of our own violence. And so, whenever someone says the church is the body of Christ, therefore, in a sense, replicating this act, that means that the church is the body of people who do not project their violence onto others, their traumas, their sufferings, their jealousies, but who take responsibility for it, who take that sin, meaning lack, into themselves, acknowledging it fully and completely. And in that full and complete acknowledgement, you can find freedom from it. The violence diminishes. Now, an example of that would be AA, where in AA, you take responsibility for the things that you've done. Instead of blaming everybody else, saying, I'm innocent, I only drink because of X, Y, and Z, you go into the room, you say your name, you say you're an alcoholic, you look at the things that you've done, you take responsibility for them, you start to phone the people you've hurt, you go and see them, you give back things you've stolen, you make amends with people. And then in that, you start to find freedom from the alcoholism, you find liberation in life. That is a religionless way of understanding what it means to be the body of Christ, to take on sin and to find forgiveness from sin, right? And it has the various dimensions, so let me kind of go through them. It respects knowledge. So this, and I say it's not necessarily the religious reading that you'll want to go with. I'm just giving you one example, but this religionless reading, it says we have mimetic desire, we have this founding violence, jealousies, aggressions, we project it out onto other people, we blame them, we don't take responsibility for that violence in ourselves, and that causes all sorts of destruction, right? But that respects our knowledge, because there's that theory is based on a deep understanding in anthropology, in literary theory, in history, in neuroscience, in biology, in evolutionary theory. So it satisfies our knowledge. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it also, for someone like Bonhoeffer, might want to say, but there is a transcendent element to it. Because, you know, Bonhoeffer might want to say, where did we learn this? Well, it wasn't a philosopher who taught us it initially, but he connects it with the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Like this event, we don't have access to it, we don't know what really happened, but what we have is testimony to something that happened in the world that that gave birth to the revelation of our founding violence, that helped us see this structure within ourselves, that helped us come to terms with it. And we don't have direct access to exactly what happened, but this event occurred, and we call the event, the Christian event. So we don't really know what that is. This happened, all of this birthed out of that event. So you could say that, okay, it respects our knowledge, but there is this evental aspect to it, or you could say there is an evental aspect to it, which is the transcendent. Then what's the other end? Oh yes, strength and weakness. Well, it respects our strength because it's saying that the church is a group of people who have the strength to take responsibility for their actions, to look at the things that we'd rather not look at, to take on our founding violence, to confess it to ourselves and to each other, not putting it onto other people, not always judging and blaming others, but taking that judgment onto ourselves. So it respects our strength, but it also respects our weakness. It takes into consideration our weakness, because it says we have violence, and we have fear, and we have suffering, we have jealousies, and we have envies. So it takes seriously that as well. And then the last one, it's not embarrassing to talk about. Like if you were at a dinner table and people were talking about their various respective professions, and you said, oh well, I'm interested in theology, and everybody goes quiet around the table and goes, oh God, what's that? Sounds like this is going to be terrible. Don't ask any more questions. But then you go, well, and you start talking about this. Go, well, I'm really interested in, violence, and you talk about this, and there's a neuroscientist at the table, and there's an anthropologist at the table, and you say, well, interestingly, anthropologically speaking, and whenever I talk about violence, I'm just talking about mimetic, mirror neurons and all of that. Suddenly you're not embarrassed, and actually people at the dinner table might take an interest, right? Whereas you might be embarrassed at talking about that within the church, because it's all magic thinking, superstition, this religionless reading people will find interesting. That's my experience as well, is when you're talking at this level, you're not embarrassed. It's great. And it's not only is it not embarrassing, people are like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that was theology. It appeals to people. It makes sense to people. And therefore then Christianity, like here's an example. A really good friend of mine, who's a writer, a filmmaker, I talked to him about this type of Christology, and he said, listen, I'm not religious at all. He says, I don't believe in God, anything like that. He says, but actually this Christology, he says, like I would call myself a Christian. Like this, I want to be a Christian. It's like I want that experience of life, that idea of taking on the violence, not projecting it onto others, and in that taking it on, finding forgiveness, as in the power of that violence dissipating, so that I can live in a community and with others in relative peace, where we are freed from envy and jealousy and the violence that comes from that. And he goes, if that's Christology, if that is the church, I want to be part of it, right? And that is something I've seen time and time again. So, suddenly you can say to someone, like, without embarrassment, oh yeah, I think Christianity has something to say. So, religionless reading of Christianity. Now, I'll just see if there's any concluding comments of Bonhoeffer, and then I'll see if there's any questions, and we'll finish it there. I'll go to the very last page, and I'll finish with the last paragraph. Bultmann, he says, seems to have somehow felt Barth's limitations. Barth's limitations being he wasn't able to do a religionless reading of Christianity. He understood that Christianity had something very fundamental, evental to speak, but wasn't able to translate that in a way that was persuasive. But he misconstrues them in the sense of liberal theology, and so goes off into a type of liberal process of reduction, right? Throwing out some bits of the Bible, keeping other bits, losing words like sin or virgin birth, but not realizing that actually there's potentially a religionless way of understanding those. If you want a religionless reading of the virgin birth, there's a little talk I gave at Christmas, and it's only like 3 or 4 minutes long, but it's a religionless reading of the virgin birth. I'll maybe link to it if you want, or you can just find it, to be honest, easy. Put in my name and virgin birth and Christmas and you'll find it. So then Bonhoeffer goes on to say, my view is that the full content, including the mythological concepts, must be kept. The New Testament is not mythological clothing of a universal truth. The mythology is the thing itself, but the concepts must be interpreted in such a way as to not make religion a precondition of faith. Only in that way, I think, will liberal theology be overcome, and at the same time its question be genuinely taken up and answered. So by that he's going like liberal theology is asking the right question, so we have to take that seriously. Liberal theology wants to speak into the world, it wants to have effect in the world, it wants to get its hands dirty in the world, but Bonhoeffer feels that in the midst of it, it loses any of its edge, any of its radicality. So he says it needs to be overcome, but also taken seriously. Thus, the world's coming of age is no longer an occasion for polemics and apologetics, but is now really better understood than it understands itself, namely on the basis of the gospel and in the light of Christ. So he's saying that a religionless reading of Christianity will give an insight into the world, an insight into how the world works better than a secular or humanist understanding, and will have effect. And I think, again, if you want one example of that, go to René Girard and his scapegoat theory, but also go to Zizek and his Christology, or also Gianni Vadamo's his Christology. Those are 3 religionless readings of Christianity. Actually, there's a good book, I don't think I have it there, it's called Christ in Postmodern Philosophy, and it gives a chapter on each of those thinkers, and shows how their reading of Christianity, I think, has a deep insight into the world and how the world works, and has good news for the world without falling into some sort of mythological or religious kind of interpretation. All right, let me just have a look, see if there's any questions here, and before I let you go. Let's see. Chaz says, do you think the rise of religion in America post the Second World War, particularly fundamentalism and evangelical theology, delayed the failure of religion that Bonhoeffer talked about? And let me take that first bit. Yeah, this is we touched on it a little bit last week, I think, but it's like this. Bonhoeffer is almost kind of intuitively advocating a secularization thesis, which is as societies progress and get more insight into the natural origins of things, the natural laws of nature, they'll become less religious. But America seems to be a little bit of an anomaly on that, and there's lots of explanations for why. But America, unlike Europe, seems to have both retained religion and fundamentalism has really taken a hold. So that seems to go against Bonhoeffer's claim. And so I think you're absolutely right I'm just looking at your question again. Delayed the failure of religion that Bonhoeffer talked about. Oh yeah, so that means that Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity, probably doesn't have as deep an effect or impact in America as it could have because of that. I think that's what you're saying. So the thing with Bonhoeffer, which is great, is one, he thinks that this is happening in the world. We're becoming more secular. God that appeals to weakness and ignorance is dying, right? But if you look at America, you could say, no, that's not right. Like after he died, there was a revival of that type of religion. But then there's the second part of Bonhoeffer, which is, of course, that it should die. like even if it hasn't died, Christianity should actually probably help that die. And yeah, so yeah, what you're saying, totally agree with it, that maybe that second part of Bonhoeffer hasn't really been felt. But that's what makes him important within fundamentalism, is in one sense you're kind of saying to the evangelical or fundamentalist church that you have to, even if it's working, even if you've got a mega church where that religious reading is working, you have to give it up. You actually have to help people get beyond it. And that's what parotheology is. Parotheology is helping people move from a religious notion of God to a religionless notion of God. And I actually work, not at the moment really, but I've worked with churches in various places, mostly in America, who have been trying to transition, not because the religious reading's not working, it is working. There's a church I know in Florida where they were being very successful with a religious reading of the gospel. So their move wasn't because it was failing. What they realized is that they had to be part of the failure. They had to actually accelerate the failure themselves. So weirdly, the church becomes the place where we need to accelerate the failure of religion, which is even hinted at in Bonhoeffer's Ethics. There's a book, Ethics, where he talks about hopeless godlessness and hopeful godlessness. But I won't go into that. So anyway, I want to see the rest of your question, sorry. And are we now just coming to terms with the God of the gaps today and seeking a religionless Christianity? I think that you're right that even today, the God of the gaps has power, and maybe less and less power in America. Like, I think that is probably the case. But even, as I say, in churches where it still works, I think they have to critique it. And I think that's the brave thing to do. It's easy to give up a religious reading when it's not working for you. but if you've got a mega church where it is working for you, and you go, oh, but we're promoting the God of the gaps, this is ignoble, this is wrong, then that is strong. And I know a church in Seattle that did that very thing in the height of their success. I could probably mention their name actually, because I think they're an amazing community, but Eastlake. They, in the midst of their big success in terms of giving religious Christianity, they came to see it as pointless in terms of the wider world, ignoble and ultimately unchristian. And they made that transition, and they lost thousands upon thousands of people, but they felt it was the right thing to do. I know you weren't asking that, but I thought you'd like that example. Perhaps this is why radical theology didn't really take hold in the 60s, but those themes seem to be coming to the surface more today. What Chaz is saying there is that in the 1960s, these ideas were really in the air, but they didn't get traction in the church. They just they held within the university, but they didn't get traction within the church. And maybe they're getting traction now. I hope they are, but it'll only be because people like you and me work hard. Because I don't know how optimistic I am that it is gaining traction, but I'm hopeful. And the reason why you're here, I'm here, is I guess we want to see this happen. So hopefully this stuff will gain traction. We'll see. Sarah says, what response do you think Bonhoeffer wanted to these writings? Oh, that's very good, right? Many Christians, this is still quoting Sarah, many Christians I know who read Bonhoeffer respond with skepticism towards the church. Either a weak skepticism that is characterized by staying in the church with apathy, or trying to make a better version of the church. How do you characterize the nature of the kind of faith that he is proposing? What response is he hoping for? I was always turned off to him because everyone I knew who read him seemed bitter and cynical. The faith at the centre of his writing has surprised me. He was pointing to what needs to be cut away, but he doesn't stop there. How do you describe your pedagogy for teaching people to see past the deconstruction? I know it's not possible to control how people react to teaching, but my concern as a teacher is that this common reaction will just create a cycle that leads to further extremism. Very good. And there's a second bit you mentioned. I recognize that this is like 3 separate questions. I was about to say there's so much in what you've said. We could take a couple of hours unpacking it, but we need to, because what you're asking is so important. So I'll kind of like maybe very quickly respond to each bit. So what response do I think Bonhoeffer wanted to take from these writings? There's a point where Bonhoeffer, and we talked about it actually at the last session, where Bonhoeffer said, we're not at the place where we're going to actually give this religionless reading. He says, I'm not going to give the answer to the problems and the questions that I'm raising in prison. And he says basically, we have to take time. If we rush to looking at what this new church is going to look like, it's just going to look like the past. It's not a big, and we need a break. This religionless Christianity is like the circumcision question. It is a break with the past that will be in continuity with the past, but it will be a break with the past. So when I read these writings, at the time, I think Bonhoeffer basically is wanting the church to stop. He's wanting to throw a spanner in the works. But as you say, it's not a bitter, cynical thing. Like oh my goodness, I mean, I don't know if you've read Ethics. I mean, Ethics is almost too much for me because it is so confessional and it is so theological, and he has such respect for the church. It's like, well, yeah, so what you're saying is so true. Like Bonhoeffer is affirming, he has such a love for the theological tradition, and it comes across in these writings as well, and in the past writings. So when he kind of wants to throw a spanner in the works, I think he is wanting to start to raise a generation of pastors who will take seriously what this religionless Christianity will look like. And yeah, I totally agree. Like, I don't think at all he wants to, he doesn't want bitter and cynical people. This is not like a deconstruction that ends up with humanism, because he's always against that. He thinks that pure cynicism of like, the churches failed will lead to a kind of a humanism, which for him is an offshoot of Christianity. It's an offshoot. It's a type of Christianity, secularized. But he's like, no. He wants to. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to a new bunch of pastors and theologians to reimagine the church in a religionless way. And to take joy in that. So yeah, I mean that's and the reason why I'm saying that is I don't want to kind of go, I reckon. I'm kind of going like, oh yeah, that's something he actually said. It was like we need to rethink this. And Bultmann was an attempt to do it, but Bonhoeffer ultimately thought that was not the right approach. I could probably say more, but I'll just say that one for now, and then I want to go on to the other bits. Many Christians I know who have read Bonhoeffer respond with skepticism towards the church. Either a weak skepticism characterized by staying with apathy, or trying to make a better version yet. How do you characterize the nature of the kind of faith he is proposing? Yeah, he says at one point that in a sense Christians should at the moment be quietly praying. So he calls it the secret discipline, where he says, you quietly worship and pray and work on a religionless reading of Christianity, and then you publicly give yourself in joy and strength to the world, giving yourself to the neighbour, and that's all you can hope for at the moment. Now, he's not talking about now, 2018, sorry. Maybe we are, I kind of believe we are at the time where we can articulate what this vision might look like. But in Bonhoeffer's day, I think he was saying, take time out, privately meet, privately reflect, privately try to work this stuff out, and publicly give yourself to the world. And he calls it this worldly Christianity, where it's like the transcendence is in the world, and give yourself to the world.
Let's see. I know it's not possible to control how people react to teaching, but my concern as a teacher is that the common reaction will just create a cycle that leads to further extremism. I think maybe by extremism, are you talking about extreme apathy? I'm not sure, but if you are, yeah, I think any teaching of Bonhoeffer that leads to a profound apathy towards theology and the life of the church, yeah, is not the right reading. And even me, I don't go to church, and I'm not part of, but I believe in the church, as in I've got a vision of what I think the church should be. And so I think that we have to take seriously Bonhoeffer's love of the church and the community, and if that doesn't come across when we read Bonhoeffer, yeah, we're missing something really important.